Thank you very much, Dean Mary. Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Friesen. It's a great pleasure for me to be a part of this evening. I'm a member of this Cathedral community, and as I say, it's my honor to moderate this conversation between Bishop Michael Oulton and Michael Enright. Before I introduce the two of them, I want to simply outline the format of tonight's conversation, and we're calling it a conversation, not a debate. Debates, in my view, especially about faith or religion or God, often tend to be about scoring points. And while it might be great fun if the person who represents your point of view demolishes the other with a particularly clever put-down, that's great, but I'm not so sure that it really elaborates or helps to explore the topic under consideration, especially for those of us who consider ourselves to be thinking people, for those of you who are truly searching for answers to your questions of faith. So if you've come here to see one side demolish the other, I hope you'll be disappointed. So tonight we're examining seriously the question, does God have a place in the 21st century? It seemed to the committee, the Faith and Life Committee of the Cathedral, as they were considering how to present this, that this would be the right topic the right way to consider a question about faith and about the future of faith and the efficacy and legitimacy of faith. It is a question for people of faith. It's a question for people who have doubt, who consider themselves agnostic. It's a question for people who have no faith. Now, I suppose the question coming from a group of Anglican Christians might indicate some uncertainty. Does God really have a place in the 21st century? What was it Woody Allen said? If there is a God, he's certainly an underachiever. And I'm sure we'll get into all that with the two Michaels, but I do hope that at least we can advance the conversation somewhat. And as Dean Mary said, you will also have an opportunity to be a part of it. We'll have a conversation for about an hour or so till about 8:30, and then we'll open up for your questions till about 9:15. And then we'll wrap, and I'm sure many of you will come and say hello to the two Michaels, and you're certainly welcome to do that. So now, special welcomes, first of all, to my friend Michael Enright from the CBC, certainly one of Canada's premier journalists in any medium, on all the platforms. As you know, he's the host of CBC Radio 1's The Sunday Edition from 9 to noon, a half hour later in Newfoundland. A program so successful, he's probably been singularly responsible for declining Sunday morning church attendance in Canada. I'm sure you've heard that, Michael.
I said Ed Sullivan killed evening prayer.
Yeah, Ed Sullivan killed evening prayer, and Michael Enright killed church attendance. And of course, most of you will also remember Michael from As It Happens, This Morning, This Country in the Morning. And prior to that, he was a noted print journalist, Time Magazine, Maclean's, Globe and Mail, and the Toronto Star, among others. He loves to ride his motorcycle. He is a member of the Order of Canada. I say he loves to ride his motorcycle, but today he took the train. So we're thankful that he did, so that he would arrive safely. And he told me as we were driving in from the Via Rail station that his mother was born and raised on Wolfe Island. So he definitely has a Kingston connection. Mike, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And a welcome also to Michael Oulton, who's the Anglican Bishop of the Diocese of Ontario, which for those of you who aren't Anglicans doesn't mean all of Ontario. It means this part of Ontario, the eastern part of Ontario, the counties of Prince Edward, Hastings, Lennox and Addington, Frontenac, and Leeds and Grenville. If you think of sort of a line from Trenton to Brockville, and north and south of that more or less covers it. And Michael Oulton's office, the headquarters of the diocese, is right across the street. He was elected bishop just over 2 years ago, and has served parishes before that in Belleville, and here in Kingston, actually in Amherstview, and prior to that also in Prince Edward Island. Michael's a native of New Brunswick. He grew up in Port Elgin, New Brunswick. He has a Master's of Divinity from Wycliffe College, University of Toronto. He has a Bachelor of Law degree from the University of New Brunswick, Bachelor of Arts from Mount Allison University, and he's still working on his doctorate, he tells me. He's a serious hockey fan, as all of you, his friends, know. He tells me he's given up being a goalie for the Leftovers League in Kingston, but he misses it a lot. So, welcome to you both.
Thank you very
Michaels,
much.
two Michaels. Thank you. I want to begin by asking both of you about your childhood experience with God and the church. I'll start with you, Michael Enright. You grew up an observant Irish Catholic boy in Toronto. Tell us about you and God and the church growing up.
Well, in Irish Catholic families of that time, very large Irish Catholic families, it was always said you left one for the church. I happen to be an only child, so there was no one left for the church. The idea of God, I was marinated in the idea of God and religion and the church. I was an altar boy from age 8, I think. My whole life was school, but then it was all of the rituals and rites of the Catholic Church, the Mass and benediction, weddings, funerals. So the idea of God was very personal, and it was very close. It was him, he. You talked to him, you said the rosary to him, you prayed morning and night, said the Angelus at noon, you were taught by nuns. You learned the rites and rituals of the church from the Baltimore Catechism. I never understood why Baltimore. I don't know what that had. I always relate Baltimore to H.L. Mencken, and of course he was not really much of a Catholic. But so there was a whole, and I came from a family of priests. I had an uncle who was Redemptorist, which is a fire and brimstone order of priests, and a couple of cousins who were diocesan priests. One was a chaplain in the Canadian Army. So it was a whole saturation of Catholicism, and this was pre-John the 23rd. This was pre-Vatican II. This was Latin Mass. This was eat a hot dog on Friday, go straight to hell. This was the God that we were inculcated with was a vengeful. I remember one nun teaching us about hell. Took out a book of matches and lit one of the matches, and then blew it out. And said to one of the kids, just touch that thing. And the kid, whoa, wow. And the nun said, hell is 5 million times hotter than that match. How she arrived at the figure 5 million, I'm not sure. But it was I think, a punitive relationship. I always felt like I was on parole. And then if I made a misstep, it was curtains, you know. But I was totally caught up in it, and I was an altar boy, and then later in my teens, I went into the seminary.
We'll come back to that in just a moment. Now I want to ask Michael Oulton about, you grew up in Port Elgin, New Brunswick,
right?
Your hometown.
Yeah.
Did you grow up in the church?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. The question. I grew up in a small town which probably had about 650 people when you added all of the dogs and cats and chickens in as well, and everybody pretty well went to church. There was a church for everybody, and everybody went to church. One of them that were in the community, and so it was just part of life growing up. I was brought up in the United Church, and my parents would take me to church. I'd go to Sunday school. And one of my earliest memories, one of my favorite hymns is Onward Christian Soldiers, which I think was 802 in the book or something like that. So when I saw it on the hymn board, I would get excited. And I would get up on the pew and I would belt out Onward Christian Soldiers, and my father would pull me down. He'd say, get down, get down. I said, I'm singing. And he said, no, you're not, you're yelling. But I'm still doing it to this very day. So, but it was part of who we were. But what I remember most of all were the clergy that were part of all of that. And I think they had, aside from the fact it was just sort of a natural part of life, these individuals were kind of these huge, luminous characters in my life. And I remember as a small child, we had one particular ministry, this massive overbite. So when he smiled, it was just all teeth everywhere. And I would see him coming out and he was just radiant. And they seemed to have this inexhaustible supply of love and caring. And as a young child growing up in small town and, you get into the school environment and there was a lot of bullying and things like that went on, church was a place where all of that got pushed aside. And it was a place of safety and it was a place of security. And as I grew up, I wanted to do that. So it was kind of the same thing. I got immersed in that sort of thing, because I can remember, going into my father's closet and getting the shirts out and turn them around backwards. It's funny because we were a United Church, so I don't know whether this said God had something to do with it. I was putting my surplice on, and I didn't even know what that was, but I put the shirt on backwards and have church in the dining room. Until one day my brother brought me my first ever bicycle I had. Was a 24-inch red CCM. I see it clearly in front of me. Put it under the cherry tree out of the window, and church got let out early that day. But it was just part of life growing up. And as I grew up, I had a deep sense that because of that relationship with the clergy and the people there and that part of it, that I wanted to do that. And that kind of was part of my being growing up. So I can relate to that experience of being marinated. I think that's a wonderful term.
It is a good
that you
term.
use for that. Yeah.
We weren't allowed to read the Bible because there might be something in there that would contradict church doctrine. And so we had no idea what Sunday school was or Bible study or any of that, which I in later years found rather weird.
Yeah.
It's kind of an odd thing to have the Bible as a forbidden book.
Yeah.
Michael, you mentioned that you spent a year at a seminary. Was it a year?
Yes.
1 year at the Passionist Seminary, Dunkirk, New York?
Not exactly the Paris of New York, but it was,
No,
yes.
it was up in the sort of the northwest corner of the state. Were you intending to become a priest?
I thought I had a vocation, a calling. And I was I was very caught up in the works of Thomas Merton, who was a Protestant who became a Catholic, who became a Trappist, who became an Eremite and a hermit, and one of the great writers, I think, of the 20th century, a poet. And I read a lot of his books. One of them that got to me was a book called The Seeds of Contemplation. I actually wrote him a letter. His name in religion was Father Lewis, and Lady of Gethsemane Monastery in Kentucky, and I wrote him a letter, and I was attracted to the idea of a monastic life, but then I also wanted to be in the world, in a kind of urban environment, or teaching or something. And I found this order of the Passionists, and they do both. They had lived a monastic, they took what's called a vow of stability, which meant if they went to a monastery, they stayed there. But some of them also taught, and there was a mission element and so on. So I went down to Dunkirk, New York, a place called Holy Cross, and I guess I was 16 when I went in. And the idea was I would go through novitiate and all of that.
But you didn't.
But I didn't, no. There were 6 Canadians down there, and the classes were very small, and we were taught the American curriculum and so on. I had to register for the draft when I turned 17. But after a while, and it was very cold, it was right on the shores of Lake Erie, so you wake up one morning and you can't hear the lake because it's frozen. And we slept in a dormitory under blankets made out of bear fur that had been used by the army in Korea during the war. And the food was terrible, and you got up at 5 in the morning and cold shower and everything, and I found it sort of oppressive. And then I wondered if I can go through all of this for the next, 10 or 12 years. And a friend in Holy Cross had a nervous breakdown, and he was, as the expression went, he was shipped to some psychiatric facility or other, and that got to me. Plus it was a very harsh educational element, always tied back to the dogmas and doctrines of the church. And so I said, I can't take this. And I wasn't looking forward. For the first time in the 400-year history of the order, they gave a Christmas furlough to us. You never went home until this one time. So I went back, and I met old girlfriends, and I drank beer and went to movies, and I thought I kind of liked this, you know. Then I had to go back to beautiful Dunkirk, New York.
Wasn't a crisis of faith so much then. It was more.
No, it wasn't. Well, I think that came later, I guess, if you use the word crisis. But no, I don't think so. I think it was a more materialistic thing.
All right. Michael Oulton, you, before you became a priest, you were a lawyer. Mm-hmm. I mentioned you have a law degree from UNB. Was it your intention to remain a lawyer? What happened? How did you get derailed from the law?
Well, we were saying before we came out that I kind of went from the sacred to the profane and back to the sacred again. And I had started out because I was going to follow the same road. I wanted to do what those individuals that had such a profound effect in my life, what I saw them doing. I wanted to do that. And so that was pretty well what the mythology was around my life, that I would just go through high school, university, I would go to seminary, and I would be ordained, and that's what I would do. And I tried to talk myself into it. The difficulty was back then, it's almost embarrassing when I think back to the view that I had around faith, spirituality, and being a leader within the church. The best way I've ever been able to describe it was, in my mind, there was God, there was Jesus, there was the angels, and then the clergy, and they were all kind of floating around in the same ether up there. And I wanted to do that sort of thing just because that's what I knew those individuals to be. And I remember, and I was going to be a United Church minister. Yeah. That's what I was going to do. I was on that course. I went through the intended candidacy program, did all the interviews, and I came for the night of the interview, and I sweated the night before. I had this night of prayer and anguish, and because I was in university, and I was kind of enjoying university, the full experience of university, and see, my thinking is that's not. I'm not that particular individual. And so I went to the interview, and I said to the interviewers, you may find this strange, but I'm here to tell you that I don't think this is for me. And they wanted to talk further. We had a long conversation about that. And I said, I need to get out for a while and live my life. And the deal that I made with God was that I will do public service. And so what I was going to do was throw myself headlong into politics and public service, and that's what I did. So I took political science and history in university, and I joined the party of my choice and became the president of its youth federation, the PC party in New Brunswick, and was involved in a lot of things, ran for and was on a seat on municipal council in my hometown, did a lot of things there, worked with a lot of people, and got a huge, the enjoyment about it was being able to make a difference. You could make a difference in people's lives. You could take a situation or a circumstance that somebody was having difficulty with and make it better or plan for the future, and I loved every minute of it. And I went through law school and became a lawyer, and that's what I enjoyed. And it was small town New Brunswick law and northern Nova Scotia law, where when somebody called you on the phone, you'd say, put the teapot on, I'll be right over. And we'd sit down and work that through. The number of times that I did the thing, I used to call it the paper, because somebody would come to me and they'd say, the bank called and I need a paper. And I said, no problem, what paper do you need? And I had this document, I wonder I'm not in jail, I had this document that I would make up, and I called it the paper, and I'd sign it, slap a seal on it, and give it to them, say, take that to the banker. Well, everybody knew everybody, and you get done what needed to be done, usually not terribly huge stuff, but for that individual, it was moving mountains, because they couldn't, access the language and that sort of thing. So I was quite content with what I was doing, but in all of it, there was a dimension that was missing, and that's where later in life, and I think as I went through university, and then Jeannie and I were married in my third year of university. You were graduated. My son's in third year university. I don't think he should have a driver's license, let alone make decisions like that. But anyway, it worked out good, thank God. And so we and my wife's a United Church minister, so it was always continued to be part. And then eventually it came to a decision where I had another conversation with God, and from a different perspective, and said, I said to the senior partner in the law firm that I was with, I said, I don't think I'm going to have any peace in life, because this kept coming around. It's a lengthy story I've shortened up, but it kept coming around, and I went to seminary in '89. So I practiced law for about 5 years. But I think
you didn't think of going into politics? I mean, you PC? Or?
I did. I ran for a nomination in Cumberland, Colchester, after Bob Coates had retired, and I didn't get that one. I ran for a provincial nomination, and I didn't get that one. It was always there was a lot of hubris there too, I think.
When I grew up, the Catholic Church was the liberal party of prayer. Right, that's what it was.
Yes, yes.
Which is why we chose you two to engage with each other. You know. Michael?
Yes.
Could you put your mic up a little bit higher?
Indeed I could, yes.
Well, for a broadcaster, you're pretty fumble-fingered there.
This is amazing. I'm terribly sorry. I apologize for this.
Michael, you must have people for that.
Yeah, do you have people for that at the Sunday edition?
How's that? Is that a bit better?
You need your fuzzy thing there.
Is that okay?
Right down on the coat there.
There you go. This is embarrassing, isn't it?
Well,
how's that?
Is that better?
Can everyone hear me? Can anyone hear me? Okay. All right.
Speak louder.
Can we both check? Can you hear me okay?
Can you hear me okay? No? So closer? Okay, I felt like I was booming out here. Okay. Can you hear me all right now? All right.
Good. All right.
Sorry about that. I please, you know, if you can't hear us, just yell. Yes.
Speak slower? Yes.
Okay. Right. This is a very boomy place. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Okay, so if we can speak a little bit slower, that would be great. All right. But please stop us again if you need to. Michael Enright, and this is going to haunt you for the rest of your life. You made a remark in an interview in the Globe and Mail in 1997 that was very critical of the Catholic Church in which you grew up. You called it the greatest criminal organization outside of the mafia. And all hell broke loose over that, as you will recall.
It wasn't one of my shinier moments, no.
But you did say it.
Yes, I did. I was quoted accurately in the Globe and Mail, and all hell did break loose.
What made you so angry about the church? And
it wasn't about the church triumphant, as we call it, or the people of God, or whatever. It was about the human institution of the Vatican. And it was just at the time of the revelations about sexual abuse, which were horrific enough, but it was compounded by the cover-ups that began in the southern US, and then in New England, and in Canada, Newfoundland, and Mount Cashel, and all that. And to me, it was the cover-up that was certainly not as bad as the abuse. Nothing could be as bad as that. But the fact that the Church and the Vatican and the political arm of the Vatican, the Curia, did little to remove the prelates who were covering up for the priests. Priests would be moved from diocese to diocese if they were, in fact, when I was growing up, there was a particular priest at my parish in Toronto who made overtures, and which I didn't have any problem. I simply told him, I used a rather blasphemous language to go away. Years later, I was in Calgary on an assignment, and on the front page of the Herald was a picture of this priest in handcuffs, and he had just been sentenced for abusing children there. And I was so angry at this, but it was the human institution. It wasn't the doctrines of the church or any of the precepts of the church. It was the fact that Rome did little to ameliorate this horrific situation. Some years later, I was somewhat gratified when an investigator for the Italian government compared the Vatican Bank to a mafia money laundering organization. So I've got a bit of my own back in that. But it was I wrote a letter to the paper and said I would never in any way attack the faith of ordinary Catholics. But no, that will be on my tombstone, I'm afraid.
I'm afraid it will.
Yes.
So you distinguish between the church as an institution
Absolutely.
and a belief in God, a sense of who God is?
Well, the idea of the Pope as the Vicar of Christ and all of that, and the representative, I don't know if I accept that, but that's what he purports to be. I'm very gratified by the current occupant of the chair of St. Peter, Pope Francis, who's a Jesuit. And in fact, the Jesuits had none of their priests were ever arrested for it. But I don't know. I tend to keep that at arm's length. I think that there's always been corruption in the church, because there's always been corruption in every human institution.
Right.
The reason that we have a celibate clergy in the Catholic Church has nothing whatever to do with higher virtue. It's because when priests were allowed to marry and they died, their children inherited property, which was an offense against Rome. So Rome insisted that priests don't marry, so if they should die, the property would go to the church. Now that's going back 6 or 8 centuries, but I still have some problems with some of the teachings, but I was attacking, or stupidly, clumsily attacking the institution, the curia, which is, the largest Catholic population in the world is in Brazil. There are 4 cardinals. Italy has 22. So I think there is a bit of, there's something wrong with the organization of the church.
Do you believe in God now, Michael?
Do I believe in God? I have a problem with the whole question of belief. Belief has caused quite a lot of pain in this world. I remember I had an argument with Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, over the question of faith. I was interviewing, he's a notorious he was a wonderful man, a notorious atheist. And I said to him that, to my mind, the idea of faith, which is a gift apparently, is a kind of like a spark gap, a spark plug. It's the thing that joins the reality to the unknown. You know what I mean? Like you kind of jump from across this abyss, and people who have it are, I think, fortunate. I don't have it, and I can't relate the lack of, well, I guess they are connected, but a belief in God has to be founded on the idea of faith, doesn't it? I mean, this is your bailiwick, Bishop. I mean, is it? I would think it's impossible to believe in God without being a person of faith.
I think faith is a critical element of that, but I think you're also spot on when you say you have to kind of separate out the institutional reality of how we express our faith.
Right.
Because faith, and it's, at least from my perspective, it's a very personal thing. It grows within you, and you're connected to others who express that sense of understanding of that which we can't see, touch, or feel. Faith is the essence of things hoped for and the substance of things unseen. That's how I would describe your spark plug from that biblical imagery. And so it's to have a sense of that which is real.
Is it a gift?
I think it's.
Can you earn it? I don't
think it's something. I think it's something that you apprehend. There is much that can cloud the ability to apprehend that. And I think when you were mentioning some of the things that were going on, like I was thinking to myself in some of my earlier comments, the question around, would it be a crisis of faith to think that you were going to do this? No, you're going to go into public service. Yeah. And for me, it never was a crisis of faith. It was a crisis with how I was going to live out my life, in what context. But faith always was a particular part of that. Times when I struggled with it, sure. But there are those things, and that's why betrayal in the midst of all of that, such as what you described. And that, from the institutional side of it, is so particularly heinous, because I think of those of growing up and those individuals that were so larger than life to me. And if I had been betrayed in the way that you described that happening to you, I don't know what would happen.
It was never about sex, it was always about power.
Yes.
But when you used the phrase, and you both have used it, crisis of faith, are you saying that the crisis only arises at the loss of faith?
I think crisis...
Because you can, I think if you get, it could be a crisis in your life if you apprehend it, you know?
Crisis, I think, if you get right into the root of the word, is opportunity. And I think you're always on that kind of knife edge in crisis. I was thinking about that in terms of the work that you do. You know, in the morning when I get up and I kind of plot out my day and the things that are going to be happening. There's some things that'll happen, such as what we're doing here today, which is fascinating. Some things in my day are more grapefruit rinds and chicken necks, and you know, necessary to construct the day. But when you get up in the morning, there's a very strong potential that you are going to have a front seat to history. And the kind of history that you have a front seat to are those kinds of crises that I think put you on the knife edge all the time. That's why I was thinking about 9/11, and on the day of 9/11, and I had to come into the Providence Center up here because we were having a meeting with vocational deacons, and I had a vocational deacon candidate in my parish. And I remember driving in, and I think you were the one that was thrust onto on that day.
That Tuesday, yeah.
I think you were that Tuesday. You were there, and I was thinking about that before tonight. What it's like to encounter not only the circumstances but the individuals that go into making up an Afghanistan or a Somalia or a Sudan or a 9/11 or a Boston Marathon and those sorts of things, and all of that struggle with a sense of who we are. I mean, our question is there a place for God in the 21st century? And I wonder, is there a place for one another in the 21st century, the way we're going? So that's why I was curious about how that kind of...
When I was at the Globe and Mail, and in the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. King in April of '68, the Globe didn't like to send married people to riot situations, so the single guys got to go to all the riots,
You were single at the time.
Oh yes, Newark and Cleveland, a whole bunch of places. But you saw these terrible things going on in Detroit, for example, in '67 was shut down entirely, and you saw what people did to each other. And I had to say, well, if there's a God, why in hell is this going on, so to speak, pardon me? Why would he allow this to happen if he is the benevolent? And I think I was raised in the tradition of the Old Testament God, the thunderbolts from on high and so on. Not the more benign, pacifistic, although Jesus was not a pacifist, but the kinder, gentler God. And I saw these things, and I saw people getting killed, and I saw cities burning and so on. And you think and Vietnam was going on, and I thought, how can this happen if there is somebody watching over us, or and Hitchens' point was always that if there is a God, he's a monster to govern and manipulate our lives the way he does, and the idea of pain and so on. I'm a great fan of Gary Wills, the professor of the historian who's written tons of books, and I've interviewed him a number of times. He's a very devout Catholic, and one of his sons once came home from school, and it was a little guy, and he said, Sister so-and-so says they're going to go to hell if something or other. And Gary had to explain to him that God was like a father, and that a father would never do that to a child, so don't worry about that. And I said to him, well, Professor, were you trying to give him a salve, or do you really believe that? I mean, come on. And he said, yeah, I do. And in fact, I asked him, I said, is there anything that could separate you from the Catholic Church? He said, absolutely, death. So I don't know many people with that kind of faith.
See, I was thinking in terms of faith as something that begins in the individual. It's that thing that you struggle with, and then you encounter others on the way. And for me, it's always been the importance of the relationship and building the relationships with one another. And ultimately, when we speak about the institutional church, and we refer to it as the body of Christ, we're speaking about it in terms of the relationships that we share with one another and with Christ.
But you can do that without God, can't you?
Well, the question is, from a faith perspective, Martin Buber, who's a Jewish writer in '63, and he wrote I and Thou, and it's the future orientation of faith that can be exciting. And I think if I catch him correctly, when he speaks about the I and the Thou, he's speaking about this relational piece which is important. And as soon as you try to put words to it, or you try to put something around it by means of your experience, it almost becomes objectified as an I and an it. And for faith, the I, Thou carries you into the unknown future. And I think that's kind of exciting. The Old Testament piece of it that I think we have to reclaim is, we do our liturgy in church, and we have the first lesson, and then we have the psalm, and then the second lesson, the gospel. And the psalm kind of gets you from the first second to the lesson to the second lesson. But really, we don't pause, and there's not a lot of preaching that's done on the psalms. But I think those psalms take us back thousands of years, this wrenching from the heart lament of people of faith who had a sense of God, and then a sense of the absence of God, and a sense of saying there is this we call the theodicy question, where is God in all of this? And that's the question that's been asked for thousands of years.
But don't you think that the generation of that question is eschatological, because we don't know what's going to happen when we die, and maybe in our heart of hearts we pray that there's a God who will do something after we go. In other words, it's fear that drives faith in some ways, and fear drives belief. I don't know if there's life after death. I really don't know. And when you said, do I believe in God? I don't believe in God, and I don't disbelieve in God. I just don't know. I haven't got the moral courage to be an atheist, and I'm a wishy-washy, don't know kind of guy, and it's never been revealed to me in any particular way. And when I was in the seminary, or the joint as it was referred to, getting up at 5 in the morning, going to Mass every morning at 6:15 became a kind of rote thing, and I didn't really grasp it.
I think it becomes very difficult. Like, I refer to that kind of as a sort of this binary view of the world, broken down to right and wrong. I'm with my tribe, you're with your tribe, and if I can get enough of my tribe around me that I can feel confident about today, let alone the future. And I think that runs totally counter to the understanding of faith.
That's Manichaeism. It's a heresy of the church.
It is. And I think for me, when you're looking at faith that carries you into that future, into that unknown, from the basis of that relationship, what I can control out of that, and that's why, because I kept asking myself, why was it that when I decided to make the move, I was going to step out of the church and I was going to go into public service? And there was a lot of it I enjoyed, and I enjoyed my law practice. And the first day back in seminary, I'll never forget it, after Labor Day in 1989, and I'm sitting in a classroom, and there's a professor at the front, and I've got a pencil in my hand, and I'm going, my God, what have I done? I mean, all of this work and effort that I had seemingly, and some would say to me, close and dear loved ones would say to me, you've thrown a lot away here. And yet there was something in that, even though I enjoyed it, there was that extra dimension that was gone. And for me, it's that relational piece. It's that sense of moving away, and that's how I understand St. Paul, or when Jesus is speaking and he's asked, what's the greatest commandment? It's easy. You can put it on the back of a matchbook. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, and it's perfect balance. And you strive for that through life. And faith says to me that in the striving I'm not alone, because relationship is such a critical part of it. Even when I'm by myself, there's a sense in which I'm not alone, and I rejoice in that. And that strengthens me to live my vocation, which I have this little piece on my Facebook. They say, your favorite quote, and it's Frederick Buechner, that your vocation or your calling is where the world's deepest need meets your greatest joy. And to me, that's faith lived out. So we're called to keep it in action every day of life and not live in this kind of binary right and wrong of the law. And I think St. Paul, the penny dropped for him when he realized that it wasn't about all of these rules and regulations and sitting at the feet of Gamaliel and knowing everything and not bashful. I mean, a man who would say, when it came to knowing it, I knew it better than anyone. But all of it was rubbish, because then he said, what is it really all about? He says, love, joy, peace, hope, faith, gentleness, self-control. Those things of the heart and soul and the relational piece.
Two of my heroes were Dan Barragan, Father Daniel Barragan, who was a Jesuit, and Saul Alinsky, who was a community organizer in the
Chicago.
60s. In Chicago, that's right. And Dan Barragan was arrested many times with his brother Joe. They were arrested because they were Vietnam protesters and so on. And he's still alive actually. Fabulous guy, I've talked to him and so on. And he was a man of great faith, and in the service of the people, of the public. Saul Alinsky he was an atheist, and quite a renegade in every aspect of his life, but he did as much good for people as, so you had the person of faith doing good and the non-believer doing good. You can do what you're saying in a secular way without a concomitant faith, can't you? Or
it can happen. There'll be the motivation that puts both people out in the field, but that's the issue that's the issue that I find a little complicated nowadays, because we get into, in addition to this binary view of the world, it's all this binary logic that says it doesn't matter how much good you do, it doesn't count because I have to do it from a faith perspective in order for it to be valid. My point of view is that the ultimate end of the church is to become secular. I think the church is supposed to be in the world, not being of the world in a particular way, but it definitely is supposed to be in the world and carrying our sense of who we are out there and joining in partnership with those who are prepared to partner with us in moving that forward. And I think that's a critically important element of our life.
I don't know, forgive me, I don't mean to be rude, but I don't know where the church is today. I don't know where you guys are. I can remember, the Jesuits were murdered in El Salvador and the nuns were raped, and liberation theology and all of that. But I don't see the clergy marching, for example, when the fast food people went on strike a couple of months ago in the US because they make crappy wages. And I don't see the social gospel being pushed by the church or various denominations. I don't see the ideas of indigenous poverty and all of that kind of thing. I don't see those being taken up by the people of faith. And now maybe that's just me, but
no, it's a challenge, and I think a couple of things there where there are aspects of that are being taken up, but the church. And from my perspective, the church as an institution, and again, separating the faith and the church as an institution, which puts that into action, in my estimation, has been marginalized progressively over time. So that when our voice is heard, we are the little match girl outside calling for attention on some of these particular issues and the things that are happening. They just don't make the center of public discourse anymore. I actually believe that to be a good thing, because I think the church does its best work when it's quietly out on the margins working.
But you remember the pictures from the Civil Rights Movement? With
yes.
Dr. King marching,
exactly.
And there were clergymen of every faith marching with him.
Yep.
And getting beaten up at the Pettus Bridge in Selma and all that. I don't know if there is that kind of energy still within the church. I don't
think
know.
you may have to separate out when you're discussing the North American situation from the worldwide situation. I just got back from May. I was a part of a dialogue with Canadian and African bishops that took place in Cape Town, South Africa. And one of those moments in time that you would love to, I said to one of the bishops, if you could just slow the clock down, was to be in a chapel at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town with Archbishop Desmond Tutu celebrating communion. And here is this man who, you know, is about 5 foot up to your shoulder, and just this immense energy. 2 days out of the hospital from prostate cancer that he's dealing with, came to that chapel and was just powerfully engaged with the people who were there. We talked about reconciliation. We met people who were part of that. And I stood and looked at the cathedral, which is, I never realized this, right around the corner from the Parliament buildings, the National Parliament buildings, and to hear the stories of the rallies that would begin in the cathedral. And they'd pour out into the street to be met by water cannon, batons, and to be shown that people were taken up to the high altar of the cathedral and beaten. And this is in recent memory.
That's right.
And yet, I see in the faces of all those people this kind of indescribable joy around their existence, not a sense of bitterness, not a sense. And I said, you know, this is something that we have to get a hold of, because I think part of our, you know, living in a blessed land and living in comfort leads us to an apathy that is stifling and killing more so. The church is always its strongest in adversity. How do you deal with that kind of apathy around how do we engage? And that's the question.
I would revise your topic theme.
Okay.
Does God have a place in the 21st century? And does humanity have a place in the 21st century? Because we seem to be denuding ourselves of everything that makes us human. We're becoming mechanistic in almost everything, in terms, certainly in my line of work, in communications. We seem to be getting further and further away from those things that make us essentially human.
Give us some examples of that.
There's a tremendous, I think, conformity abroad in the land. I grew up in the 50s, which was supposed to be the most conformist time, but now I think there's a uniformity of thought, there's a uniformity of acceptance. We use the word apathy, I think, and I think that we are apathetic, and we're also turning inward. We care about, and naturally, about children and our jobs and pensions and all that kind of stuff. But we don't kind of look out. We walk around the people lying on streets, the corners, you know? We step over them. How we live in a blessed land, but how that is allowed to happen is beyond me. I don't know. And I think that we become dehumanized in a way.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's because we all find we don't know where we're going. I think we're frightened. I think we don't feel that our institutions are serving our best interests. I think that we tend to feel that we're not going to see justice in this life, and no one knows if it's in the next. And I think that we're searching, and in the searching, we find our own vulnerability and think, God, this is terrible. You know, it's terrible.
I agree with you about the issue of fear. I think we live in a very fearful world because we can't.
It's manufactured by our governments.
I think it's from my perspective, there are things that happen and it's very difficult to put any definition to or understand. And you know, the mall situation in Nigeria. In Kenya rather, and the Nigerian conflict, the civil strife that's happening there, or Sudan, and what people are doing to one another, and the complete disregard for any sense of the sanctity, and I use that word very deliberately, of human life.
We get all excited about what happened in Kenya, and it's terrible. but there are 500,000 children starving to death every year. And I went, oh, it's not terrible.
Yes.
It's not awful. I'll write a check for $10. I mean, I don't want to dismiss what or demean what you're saying, but fear used to drive people to great things in a way, to overcome it. And now I think the fear is turned inward, and we shy away. We don't, just leave me alone with my television and my pension, and just don't get in my way.
It's one of the things that I think is a critical problem, and this is where I think that faith can address this, is the objectification of humanity. And one of my favorite theologians is Johann Metz, a Roman Catholic, and he speaks about becoming subjects before God rather than being objects of God's divine activity, so God does to you. And he speaks about solidarity, and he speaks about having a political theology that is the theology of the city, where humanity is the subject of all of that, and there is this solidarity that extends to solidarity with those who have no voice, solidarity with those including the dead who have gone before, because that's a powerful part of his experience growing up as a young person during the Second World War in Germany, and the things that he experienced, and that following the war, when he would ask those questions, how could this happen, to get the response, we don't talk about that. We can't, because how can you deal with the enormity, as you were saying about starving children in the world? How can I sit at my kitchen table and deal with that enormity? So I push it to one side, and it's much easier
deal with
to
the people sleeping on the streets. You can demand of your governors that something. You remember when I don't know if it was in the Chrétien administration or Martin, we were going to do away with child poverty by 2010. That's it. There will be no more child. Excuse me. And I think it's just the idea that we are, if not hopeless, at least helpless. We feel helpless. We feel that we don't, and maybe faith steps in.
What could you expect of faith, of the church, of a community of the faith in that regard? What would you like the church to do?
I've gotten to know Hans Küng over the last 10 years, a great German theologian who's been silenced by the church, by Pope Paul VI. He talks about the church militant, and that is the people in the pews going out on, after Mass on Sunday and doing something. And I think that that perhaps at one time was the case. I'm not sure that it is any longer. And the breakdown of religion and the breakdown of institutions and our faith in institutions, so on, it's pervasive, it's ubiquitous, it's all over the place. What would I want to see?
You're here in a church. You're sitting across from a bishop. Some of them in the pews are the faithful. What would you want the church to do?
There's a place in Toronto called Covenant House that is for teenagers who are they're addicted to substance, or they're out of jail, or they don't have a job, or and Covenant House helps them, and I'm sort of involved in things. And every year, to raise money, a group of people will sleep outdoors in the cold in November with just a sleeping bag and a cardboard thing. And the chief of police does it, and other people, and they sleep out all night. You don't see many clergy doing it. I would like to see the ministers and the rabbis and the priests sleeping out in a sleeping bag on a cardboard pallet, which is not to say that they don't care. I don't mean that. But it's the manifestation of their faith that I would like to see more prominently displayed. I think that answers your question. Okay. I hope that answers your. I mean, I would like to see more demonstration of it, and in my own life as well. I mean, I'm not just the phrase is holier than thou, I think. No. I'm just saying that I would like to see a more concerted effort.
Can I just? We're going to have to wrap up in a moment and take questions from the audience, but let me ask you this, Michael Enright. I certainly understand your calling the church back to its role in social activism in some way, in doing good for people. But what about the church's role in nourishing our own inner spirituality? You told me, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, just before we came out, that you're going to Vermont to a monastery for a week. Presumably you're attending to your own spiritual self in some way. I'm putting words in your mouth. But what about the church's role in that, and what that ultimately does to us in the way we live our lives?
I'm always suspicious of people who say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm very spiritual. Oh, I'm so spiritual. I don't really go along with that. I've gotten a lot of comfort in Eastern religions, particularly a Vietnamese monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, who is, his whole idea is the idea of mindfulness and how you can center yourself by thinking not of the past or the future, but his example is when you're doing the dishes, you're not doing the dishes to get them clean, you're doing the dishes to do the dishes. In other words, you are focusing entirely in the present. And I find that is, and it's Thomas Merton before he died in Thailand, he was moving toward Buddhism. He was moving away from Catholicism toward Buddhism. And yes, we're all on a spiritual quest, I think, but I'm not sure I can find it in the prayer books and the rosaries and I think it lies inside of us. Going down to Vermont in the monastery, there's a difference between silence and quietness. It's a quiet thing, and I forgot who said it, but you can tell me, but someone said the problems of mankind, the only problem with mankind is the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And that's what the monastery gives me. So.
A final question to you, Michael Oulton. Does it matter what denomination we belong to?
Does it matter? My immediate reaction is no. I started out and grew up in the United Church, and I think when we start to, institutionalize faith and spirituality, we limit it immediately by that. I was just thinking as you were speaking about something my wife and I chat about, where I'll say in the Anglican, we have our Anglican three-legged stool: scripture, tradition, and reason, and we're always holding up reason. And she will always then say, but you're missing one, because she's more of a Wesleyan and they have a quadrilateral, and she will add in experience and the importance of that experience that happens. And that calls you into various places, and where you grow and are fed and are nourished in your spirituality and in your faith can be in very different places. When I was on Prince Edward Island, we had a huge issue with seniors housing. And I went around to my colleagues in the various other churches, and I said, do you have the same problem that I have in my own church? Which we all did. And long story short, we came together and we formed a not-for-profit corporation, and we built a seniors residence that the whole ethos of it was to protect the dignity of the individual and provide a place where they could live out their years and not be worrying about all of those infrastructure needs and things like that. It was an amazing example of the kind of partnerships that can happen. What was there was greater than the sum of its parts. And that's one of the things that why I'm so pleased about having a dialogue like this, is that we can begin to plumb the depths of faith and spirituality, but we can also link the fact that we have a missional imperative, because before Jesus left, he said, I am sending you out now into the world. But from my faith perspective, I said, I'm not sending you out alone. And you have this good news to share. And you live a life of self-giving, in that sense of where, Jesus, who gave of himself all the way to the cross, so that those future-oriented questions are already answered for me. Life and life beyond death, that's something I don't spend a lot of time thinking about. I then take that, what does the here and now say? So I'm not one to say that, my tribe matters to the point of exclusivity. I think it would make for hard home relations.
Let me just answer your question. This is where I come from. When I was about 12 or 13, one of the kids in the neighborhood was still in the era of polio, and she died. Her name was Irene Pryor, and she died of polio. And her mother asked if some of her friends could be pallbearers. And I was told by my parents, not only could I not be a pallbearer, but I couldn't go to the funeral because it was in a Protestant church. And that was just anathema. So when you talk about denominations,
Right.
I come from a background where the walls are up. I don't know if they still are.
I think it depends on where you are.
Yeah,
because
it
there's
does.
a lot of close relations.
Yeah.
I do want to open this to, we've promised to open this to all of you who have been listening faithfully over the past hour. We've got Larry there with the microphone, or no, Dean Mary is going to hand Larry the microphone. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and Larry will give you the microphone, and we will take the question.
Questions are better than throwing things, so that's nice.
Right.
Yes, my name is Bill Lewis. I've been an Anglican since I was 7, which was many years ago. You invited your guests to spend a moment on their personal stuff, so the question becomes relevant.
I'm having a hard time. Are you having a hard time? Can you hear him? Okay.
There's a lot of reverb.
Okay. Just a moment to why I'm asking this question is that I've been a regular attendant since the age of 7. My children lasted until they were about 30. My older grandchildren lasted until they were 13. My younger grandchildren didn't even start. I wrote my question down so I would get it. That's my motivation for the question. It's been said, can I get better light? Most people know I can't read in bad light.
Are you going to give us the question?
It's been said, I still can't say it, sorry, that the reason Hitchens and Dawkins have such traction in today's world manifests that society that has a problem with the modern God. A God reduced by the methodology and theology of yesterday and today's churches. A deity become irrelevant. So my question wouldn't be, does God exist? And more, has he become irrelevant in today's world? Thanks.
Does he exist?
Does God exist, and has he become irrelevant?
I'll let the bishop field this one.
The challenge, Bill, I think a bit of the challenge is too, we live in a society, from my perspective, that requires answers instantaneously. We live in the society of drive-throughs so that that are timed, so that the staff inside know that they can only go a few seconds, and if they get beyond that, they're going to hear from their supervisor because the customer needs it now. Faith and spirituality we refer to as a journey and a pilgrimage, and something that you commit over the course. It has a much larger arc than we're used to in our society. So sometimes a lot of it has to do with, I have things that need to be dealt with now. I can't wait, and part of it is around all of it, to be able to deal with my particular situations. I speak to God, and it seems that there is no answer. That is, I think, a huge challenge, which is a cultural challenge for us nowadays. We have to speak in terms of faith, that as we live in the question, as we live in the ambiguity, as we live in the uncertainty, we live there with one who will shape and mold us and draw us into relationship with one another to support each other more in the question and the difficulty than in finding the answer. And it's always wonderful when the answers appear. So how many times I wish, you look in the morning and say, just burn that up on the wall over there so I know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing next and how it's supposed to go. Because this discernment model that has been part of faith and spirituality since the beginning requires patience. And interestingly enough, I think that was one of the penny drop moments for St. Paul, because in his listing of those gifts that he speaks about, one of those 9 gifts of the Spirit that he says replaces the binary view of right and wrong and instantaneous answers that he was used to, one of those gifts is patience, and probably he asked for some of that for himself. I think it's a challenge for us in society nowadays, because there's no easy way to answer that and provide us with that kind of instant gratification when it comes to faith and spirituality.
I don't know whether God is relevant or irrelevant. I have a feeling that the idea of God is irrelevant.
What do you mean by that?
That that when one thinks about a God figure or God or something, that it's really has no relevance to one's daily life. That there isn't the relationship that you talk about and hope for. I don't think that exists to the extent that it did once.
And why do you think that is?
Look around, look at what's happening. God may be, he may exist or may not, or she may exist or may not, but I think the idea of godliness and a God, I think, is less relevant than it was. I think that probably flows from the breakdown of our religious institutions. I think the church ain't as relevant as it was, therefore is God relevant? I don't.
Let's take another question from the floor. Yes, and hold the microphone close to you so we can.
I'll try so I can be heard. My first is just a comment. When you're saying often, where is God through the things that are happening in our world right now? I think personally that he's asking us the same question. What are you guys doing? I think that you can reverse it a little, that we have to help each other through this and try and live as God would have us in this world. My second question, well, that wasn't a question, but is for Michael. I didn't understand what you meant when you said you felt that the church should be more secular in the world. I wondered if you could explain that comment.
I think there's a challenge because of the challenges that the church faces within society, that there's a natural reaction to pull back, to pull in behind the doors. I think that if you read some of the Alban Institute material that comes out now, they talk about the mission field, and the mission field for the church has shrunk down right to the threshold of the door. So when you walk out beyond the door of your church, you are in the mission field. Well, we have chosen to come inside to that extent. We've chosen to withdraw from the field, and not only have we chosen to do that, we've been pushed out of it in many different areas. And I think that's a huge challenge for the church, to find that courage to walk out into a society that hopefully has us safely ensconced in here and say we have a voice within society. We are part of the community. I was in Maynooth on 2 Sundays ago for their 100th anniversary of their church. And the mayor of Hastings Highlands came and did a presentation about the history of the community, including the church. And I said that there are two things that we celebrate when we have those anniversaries. We talk about a legacy of faith over a particular period of time, but we also talk about the fact that this church, this institution, and the people of faith who have chosen or who have been called to be present here have been part of that society. That we are one of those focal points of social discourse, social action, but that we have conversation to bring to the table. And that's what I refer to when I think of the church needing to be more, I think the secularization of the church is a good thing. Because we have to get out there and say we have a place to be in society. We have to form partnerships with those who will answer the questions that we may have formulated from a faith-based perspective, but we have a voice to bring to that table. And I think that's, when I think of the church, and I think that I may get a lot of that from Metz, who talks about the church needing to be a secular institution in that way. And he was a student of Lonergan and all these fellows. I mean, the Vatican II imagery, and I think too, sometimes as goes Rome, so goes the world, and that's why I share with you a lot of excitement about Pope Francis. I think when he talks about a poor church for the world, when he talks about the kinds of things that he has been, when he talks about the church's obsession with particular aspects of our faith, such as human sexuality, and says, and makes some fairly blunt statements around this, and wants the church to be missionally focused once more. I think he's calling it, and I think as much as Vatican II influenced the life of the churches, Christian churches throughout the world, I think Pope Francis has set us on that road. And our new Archbishop of Canterbury also, they were both elevated about the same time. And Justin Welby speaks much of the same language. And to me, the missional imperative is critical for us. And we have to take seriously the statement, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am among you, and then get out and start doing it. Spread that word, that good news, and live that law of love in the world. And that's what I mean about the church being secularized, being part of the world that way.
Okay. We have another question here on the floor.
I'm Deborah Figuth. I want to pick up on something that Michael Enright said about the church not being involved enough in the social gospel. And I personally know of a lot of ways and areas that the church is, and I won't even start to list them, but just 2 examples. One is in Canada, we can sponsor refugees privately. The vast majority of organizations sponsoring refugees are religious-based, and the vast majority of those are church-based. The other thing is in the area of human trafficking. It's been in the news quite a lot lately. I know there was something on the Current this morning about human trafficking. Christian organizations have been involved in fighting human trafficking for years now, and there's lots of them working at education and intervention and providing retraining for girls taken out of trafficking and so forth. So I was just wondering if you are aware of those kind of things that churches and Christian groups are involved in.
So, Michael?
Well, I don't think I accept your assertion that most of the work going on in the world is from faith-based organizations. I think there are a lot of organizations that have nothing whatever to do with any organized religious input. I do think that there are numbers of churchly people and there are organizations, Christian organizations, that do incredible work in terms of poverty and in the mission field that you talked about. I don't get a sense, and I know that the church is persecuted in a number of places. Churches are burned, Christians are killed or shot or whatever, but I don't get a sense that in North America, which I know better than other parts of the world, there is a church militant, that there is an organized or even ill-organized effort to correct the problems of poverty and homelessness and lack of civil rights of indigenous people and so on. I don't see a concerted, I see the church defensive about many things. That's why we have a reconciliation committee now because of the residential school abuses. But I don't really see a lot of prima facie active work by organized religion in this country.
Okay. We have another question here.
Yeah. Tonight I heard, 2 things that I've been wrestling with in the past I would say for a while, because I have a brother in Jamaica who keep asking me, why does God allow all these atrocities to happen? All these well, we know all the different things that happen, whether it be hunger, whether it be bombings, whether it be, killings, whether it be man's inhumanity to man. And I keep saying another thing that I hear tonight about, well, we have to keep the faith because God has a purpose and He will work things out and so forth. Well, I'm going to reverse the question to both Michaels. I would like to ask Michael Oulton, well, what direct answer you'd give to, well, why does, as Michael Enright said, why do you believe God allows these things to happen? What is would be your answer to somebody? And to Michael Enright, I would ask really, when you sleep on the street, surprisingly, I support Covenant House because they send us all these lovely cards and all that. And when you sleep on the street or when you do things for maybe Covenant House, would you say the same thing as faith would help to solve what you're saying in your own small world, some of the atrocities? Do you feel that is part of the answer, that faith will help to, well, save us from thinking about why does God allow this to happen? So, in other words, I'm asking you the faith question, if you believe that is helping to solve that part of the problem about why does God allow this to happen. And I'm asking Michael to say, well, why you believe God allow these things to happen? Can we just say, well, faith, which we know is a personal thing, other people don't know about the faith, or we'd say, all right, in the Middle East, in Africa, some of these people have never heard of God. In the 18th century, we have all the missionaries going out that all these people, the world will be filled with the glory of God. But these people still have not heard the word. I mean, well, they don't have the faith. Well, is that the answer to the atrocities? If faith? Well, I don't know.
Thank you. Do you want me to start with the first part? When you were speaking, I was trying to sort of sift around for an image, because that question, which basically is boiled down to where is God in all of this, when you look at those situations. And what came into my mind was, and I love the way that Jesus would use parables to describe truths that he wanted to communicate, which meant that we had to do some of the work. He would tell a story and people would say, what is he talking about? And even his own disciples would kind of argue that point with him. And he would explain it to them in private, but it was that engagement with the people and working with that kind of thought. When I think about that question, there's the parable that Jesus tells, the parable of the weeds, where the farmer goes out and sows a crop, and an enemy comes and sows bad seed. And it's kind of it's a funny way to get back at somebody, really, because I guess you got to really hate somebody, because usually when you want vengeance, it's sort of in the moment. But he goes and sows the seeds and got to wait a while for the mischief to happen. But eventually the servants note the bad seeds growing with the good, and says to the farmer, what do you want us to do about this? And the farmer says, just wait. Just let them grow up together. And then at the harvest time, that will be sorted out. I think that parable for me, is almost addressing that particular question, because in the moment, when you see these acts happening, when you begin to grapple with people's motivations for that and why this could be permitted, that horrible footage from just to pick one of 1,000 images that were bombarded with the Boston Marathon last year, and that at the finish line, and that image that we saw over and over again, and that question. And so the struggle is around living into the fact that these things happen, struggling with those questions, but recognizing that God is present with us in it. And that's the strength and power, I believe, of our faith as we help us through. The other part of that says that some of these things that we deal with call us to action. One of the chaps that I met in South Africa was a priest who was working in one of these horrific, what they call informal settlements, this one was called Sweet Home Farm, and the name certainly belied what it was. It was a settlement of 14,000 people built on a garbage dump. And this priest that I met, his name was Father Joy. And so my first question is, I said, how did you get the name Joy? And he had this big laugh, and he said, oh, when I was born, my parents always wanted me to remember Jesus, others, and yourself. And so they named me Joy. And I never met a man in my life who lived his name like this fellow. He saw these men who would come out from this settlement and try to find work in town. They would go into Cape Town, and at the end of the day come back and be kind of thrown out of cars, maybe paid, maybe not paid. And he went to work with them, and then he said, I didn't have a clue how I was going to start, but I knew I had to go help those people. And he went into the community, and long story short, there's a school, there's a whole initiative that a number of parishes have come together to work on. Does Sweet Home Farm still exist? Yes, it does. Are 14,000 people living in squalor? Yes, they are. Are there answers coming from government institutions to solve that? No, they aren't. Yet there are those who are saying that in the face of such suffering and hardship and hopelessness, we are going to be bringing the light of another presence. And so I think that's sort of the parables made real for us. Jesus speaks to us, gives us an image, and then calls us to work on it. I think that's also in the mind, but also in how we live our life each and every day. And I think Deborah was speaking about the things that the churches do. I mean, the Sisters of Providence in this community have stood on the City Hall steps in silent vigil every Friday for well over 10 years. It's been a long time that they've had that vigil. And I went down shortly after I became bishop to stand with them on the anniversary, I think it was the 10th anniversary of that vigil, calling out against poverty, hunger, homelessness, and they go every week. So again, in some books, it may be a small measure, but when we stop thinking about those particular situations, and especially when people of faith stop thinking about those particular situations, then I think we have done a great disservice to our own identity.
I'm chagrined to say that I didn't quite understand the question. Were you saying that how do people without faith deal with these questions of spirituality? Was that your question?
No, I wonder if you believe that faith, to some extent, will answer the question about my video on the atrocity, you said you might be sisters to still sleep and so forth. Right. So is that in a small way you say that faith and doing things in a wrong small way we solve the bigger question of the atrocity?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I don't know what flows from the kind of activities you're talking about. Maybe you can, pardon me, attack problems in a small way that will somehow enlarge your own sense of spirituality, or if you are a person of faith, can emboss it in some way and increase it. But I don't know. I don't know if good works get you to heaven. I think that you.
Michael's microphone is
oops, it's gone again.
there. You are. Yeah.
I'm going to hold it this time. I think that you behave in a human way because it's the right thing to do. And I'm not sure that faith, I don't think it's like the central bank. I don't think you get dividends from it. I think it's something you do because that's what humans should do. And the point you make about small things, I think that's critical, because we can't solve the problems of the world, but we might be able to not step over someone lying on a sidewalk.
Let's take another question.
Thank you for this conversation. The question, as I understand, was, does God have a place in the 21st century? And issues have come up as to whether God is irrelevant. And I wonder if, in fact, the question could be phrased, have we displaced the possibility of apprehending God from the 21st century. Bishop Oulton, you spoke about faith as the ability to apprehend, and so many things can get in the way. And Michael Enright, you talked about the need for quiet and going to a monastery in order to have quiet. And we hear about God speaking through the still, small voice. And when we see how difficult it is for people to know, does God exist or does God not exist? And it seems that I sometimes think of Helen Keller and wonder if we're all a bit like that, if people know that story, being blind and deaf and needing Annie Sullivan needing to communicate by making signs in her hand. And if she didn't have her hand open and wasn't open to the possibility that somebody was trying to communicate from outside of herself, she would never know about Annie Sullivan or any of the other things that went on. And when I think how difficult it is for us to apprehend God much of the time, or to know if God is speaking, I wonder if the 21st century is really a particularly troublesome place for that to happen, given the busyness, the overwhelming inputs we have, the constant stimuli, the lack of quiet, and whether you might comment on whether that isn't perhaps what the question's about.
Well, there's a lot in that question. I can't, again, I have to beg, I can't answer that. I don't know what it means to be relevant for God in the 21st century. The question I keep coming back to is whether we are to each other and to some kind of, if you will, a spiritual ethos that you embrace. I think it's a question, it's not one of those questions of theological playtime, well, how many angels on the head of a pin. I think it's a crucial thing that I think people of faith have to answer for themselves. I don't think I have to answer it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's an interesting question, because the question itself belies the fact that we are actually in the 21st century, because when I think of God as a person of faith, when the question is there a place for God? As I understand God, when Moses said, will you tell me who you are so I can give some kind of CV to the people that are going to ask that, God basically said, I am. The name of God is the very name of existence. And when Jesus was using imagery for himself, so from a faithful Christian perspective, as I live it, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the good shepherd, I am the vine, I am. Faith is about existence. And so the question is, the God of the 21st century is the God who spoke from the burning bush, the God who moved over the face of the waters at the beginning of creation and created all that is. Our minds can never in this lifetime, and I think that was another, I think St. Paul had so many, the penny drop for him moments when he said, you know, in this life we see in a mirror dimly. And that's the best we can hope for. We can hope for, if that's platonic or whatever, you know, we can only hope to get those reflections of that which we can't possibly hope to apprehend. But faith is that which tells you that there is that which is that creative power of all existence as we understand God. And so it's an interesting question, because in the 21st century we need to compartmentalize, we need to objectify, we need a place for everything and everything in its place, because these first 2 decades of the 21st century have been all about everything in the world being in disorder. And so we try to find order, including where does God fit in all of it.
Albert Camus wrote a book called The Myth of Sisyphus. And you know from Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned to push a huge rock up a hill, and then it would fall back down again, and he had to push it back. He had to do that for eternity. And in the book, Camus said that the only question that human beings have to answer in this life is, do I or do I not kill myself? And if you decide that you're not going to, you have to behave in a certain way. And his argument was that, however you define faith, it wasn't getting the rock to the top of the hill The importance was the pushing, and the importance was not the end and not the goal, but it was the process. And that may be a very humanistic rather than a faith assertion, but to me, there's no such thing as happiness. Happiness is a process, and I think being human is a process. And I think it's maybe for people of faith it's easier than the rest of us, but I think that the methods, the processes are more important than the ends, if that makes any sense at all.
One of my favorite movies is The Mission, and Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro, and there's that powerful imagery of Robert De Niro lugging the armor up the hill. I'm thinking of that as you mentioned the stone, so I would answer from the faith-based perspective as I live it, that for me it is the burden being cut away by the one who had been offended, and the realization that there was no burden anymore.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that's where we live into that as people of faith, and that's where the power and the strength of it is. And so if we experience that joy for ourselves, then we cannot help in our actions and in how we orient our lives to help others to see that self-same gift out in the world. And I think that's part of what we're called to do as people of faith. And yes, we always need to be challenged to engage.
We've got another question on the floor here.
I think I'm the youngest person in the room. My question is, well, I'm a teacher and I have a 4-year-old, and this morning, well, this afternoon I had to take her back to daycare, and she had, whether it was willingly or accidentally, taken a stuffy from daycare home with her over the weekend, and she fell in love with it, and I had to talk to her about taking it back to the daycare because it didn't belong to us. And so as her dad, I took her back and we talked with the daycare and we handed it back, and she cried the whole walk home. And I couldn't do anything to console her, but that was my job. So first of all, my observation is I'm fairly new to the church. I grew up not with the church in my life really at all, other than that it was next door and my mother told me never to go there. But I'm new to the church, and my understanding when I think of God, if there is such a thing as God, I would view God as the ultimate Father. And in my view, when we ask about why these atrocities happen, why these things happen around the world, and why does God let them happen, my view is that God is the Almighty Father, or, He's like everyone's Father, and His job is not to fix things. His job is to guide us to fix our own problems. As a teacher, I'm hounded by grade 6s all day asking me to fix their problems. And my job is not to fix their problems, but to guide them to help them fix their own problems. So I prefaced my question for you with that in mind, because my question is actually not so much, is there a place for God? And this is mostly directed to Michael because I really enjoy your show on CBC every morning, as do my children, which is kind of a weird thing because they're 8 and 4. But my question for you is not so much is there a place for God in the 21st century, but is there a place for the church in the 21st century?
Yeah, good question. Is there a place for the church in the 21st century? Michael Enright.
I don't know. I think as long as there are people who want to profess their faith and their belief systems, there has to be some forum and some venue. I remember 30 or 40 years ago, you can correct me, Pierre Burton wrote a book called The Comfortable Pew.
Right.
In which he talked about how Christians in this country had become apathetic, and there was a resultant decline in church attendance and so on. Is the church relevant in the 21st century? I think it is, but perhaps not the reason that many of you think. I'm a great believer in continuity of human activities. And I think it's important that Samuel Johnson said about journalists, it's not only the duty of the journalist to inform, it's the duty of the journalist to remind. And I think the church in its organization and in its works reminds us of where we came from. And I think that there's always the thing about the church is that there is always the potential for change. There's always the chance that there will be reform and things will change. When the bishop talked about Pope Francis, I can imagine a Vatican III coming around the corner, where there is a risorgimento of opening up the windows, as John the 23rd said. I would say the answer is yes, that it's possible for the church to be relevant in the 21st century, and I think it's going to be a very tough haul, but I would hate to see it disappear altogether. I think that would not help things if suddenly the churches closed their doors and folded up.
Do we have another question?
Yes. By the way, that young man is doing probably the most important job in this country, and that is teaching.
Teaching. Yes, you're here.
Yeah, my name is Louise, and I live in poverty because of a disability. But one of the most important things to me is faith. And I think one of the saddest things I could ever see is to see a church start to lose sight of that faith, the lessons that our Lord taught us, and how Jesus reached out to the people who were the least. That would be the children, that would be the prostitutes, the people despised in society. And then you look at the strength the church gives you by being part of it, and what strength you get inside when you can reach out and give through the church. And giving doesn't mean just money, it just means going to the church and being able to contribute and help someone in another way. And I think that that's where I see our church has a lot of opportunity now, especially in these days of economic downturns and so on, and bringing our sights back on what's the most important, which is the people versus the money or the economy or the amount of wealth we can generate. I think that's where the church has its place in today's century.
Thank you.
I just want to say something, and I should have said this earlier perhaps. I envy people of faith. I envy the fact that they can believe in something with a reality that is denied to me. And I really think, was it St. Paul? I don't know, I'm going to misquote him. But did he not say, act as if he had faith? Was that not part of it? And I know in my church, that's part of it, that if you act as if you have it, you will somehow get it. So I envy the people of faith, and you say it's the most important thing in your life. I think that's fabulous. It doesn't apply to me.
I think your comment resonates with the previous speaker. Is there a place, is there a relevance for the church in the 21st century, or in any century for that matter, if we have a vision of the church, as I think people of faith, in my humble opinion, should, that the church is the gathered body of the faithful in wherever it is found. That we take seriously when Jesus said to the disciples walking out of Jerusalem, and they were amazed by what they saw, these young lads from small town Galilee, and Jesus said, there will be a time when not one stone will be left standing on another. I mean, it's a very powerful message for us. We live and move and have our being and express our spirituality, and I come from an aspect of Anglicanism that looks at our faith in terms of its expression in word and in music and in architecture and all of those things which speak in the best way we can about the sense of passion we have for God as God has for us. But when the objects become the subjects, that becomes a problem. The people are the subjects. And it's the subjects of divine activity, it's the subjects of the church's activity. And I think we're constantly called back to that reality. And the Gospels speak powerfully to that, and the imagery that Jesus gives to us, and says that you are strengthened for that work in the world. Leslie Newbigin was a bishop in South Africa, a renowned missionary bishop in South India, and he had this wonderful view that for the church, Jesus was already out there beckoning the church over here. This is where the work takes place. And these are the people, by the way, you're called to work with. And so it's not a question, I think, Michael, of, act as if you had faith. Act. And people of faith should see what you're doing and say whether their faith is saying, we can partner with you, we can work with you because we're called to do this. And we can discuss what puts us both out in the field doing that particular work. But as long as we continue to see ourselves as church in that way, and again, I go back over and over again to that missional imperative that we have, then we're living, in a phrase I use a lot, living into who we are as disciples of Jesus Christ.
We're going to have time for one more question.
This will be the last question.
One more question.
I better make it good then. I also live with a disability, and faith is a really important part in my life too. My upbringing, I was raised a Catholic, but my family went away from the church for various reasons, and so when I was a young child, it was kind of taken away from me. But when I was about 20, there was just something there, and I came back to it on my own, which was probably a good way to do it. But I'm often in conversations with family and stuff, those who don't believe versus me who does, and so I think about this issue a lot. And from the readings and things I've done, the basis of it is that God gave us free will, so we get to choose whether to believe or not. If God was going to do it the other way and just have us all believe, I mean, we would all be the same, nothing would be any different. And I look at, when I think of this issue, I understand why people have a hard time with organized religion. And those who don't believe then almost, it's funny, they don't believe in God, but they want to blame God for all that doesn't go right. And I find that, people, that's almost the way it works, is that there's a God as long as things are going well. But when things aren't going well, there mustn't be one. Because if he was here, why would he let these things happen? And I think it's beyond us to know. It would be the same as me having a disability and saying, why me? Why not me? It's just the way that it is. And I think that God maybe is disappointed because really, the wars, the things that we've been talking about all night, the poverty, are within our grasp as humans to work on, and God gave us a brain. It's humans, it's people that are disappointing. I don't think it's God. When we look around, God is there, and he reveals himself to us in various ways if we're open to looking. So I guess I just wanted to share that and hear your reflections on that.
Brief response from both of you, perhaps?
Well, bravo. I mean, the sentiment is terrific. It's the execution that I have a bit of trouble with.
Yeah, somebody once told me that you can have the best plan in the world until you add people. And then everything, but also you can have the best plan in the world, you add people and you find out you get a better plan. It's the dynamic, the creative dynamic that happens that we're called to undertake. I think from the faith perspective, when we grapple with that and when we deal, I used to say in parish ministry, it takes many jelly beans to make up the jar. And that's the beauty of it in terms of the work we do. And I think, how can I put this? From a perspective of faith, it's all of those individuals taken together, the ones that you I'll give you this image. And I think I've used it here before, but it's the one that speaks to me so powerfully. Henry Nouwen, L'Arche community, Jean Vanier, I had the privilege of hearing him preach at Trinity College Chapel, and he preached, and one of the things that he said, it'll stick with me for the rest of my life. He said, every person you meet in this world, there's two things you know about them, right off the bat. You know, number one, they were created by and are passionately loved by God. And the second thing you know without fail is that they are a gift to you today. And I can think of all the people that I have no problem saying, yep, gift, no problem. And then there are the other people that I have to work at it with. And can be more of a challenge. But I believe that what Henry Nouwen said is true from a faith-based perspective. They are a gift to you. And I think God will bless us in our activities and our endeavors, and also God is present with us when everything turns to mush.
I think it's interesting you mentioned Henry Nouwen, because Henry wrestled with the question of faith all his life. And he went through depression after depression, and I don't know what the conclusion, he died tragically young, suddenly, but he was a man who wrestled with the whole concept of faith and belief.
And it's Jacob wrestling with the angel, exactly. And Jacob goes away wounded from the encounter, but receives the blessing. And again, we could spend a lot of time talking about that.
We could.
Yep.
We certainly could. Listen, first of all, I want to thank the two Michaels for giving us the opportunity to take part in this, to hear and be involved in this wonderful conversation. Bishop Michael, thank you. Michael Enright.
Thank you so much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we wrap it up, and we say thank you to all of you for coming. Mary, is there anything we need to add before we wrap up?
I think we want to thank Eric as well, and all of you, Michael and Eric, and all of you for giving us your evening to come and take part in this very stimulating conversation. I know that there are lots of other things to be said, and I'm sorry if we couldn't take every question. We hope that this recording will be available on our website, and you can look us up on stgeorgescathedral.ca. And incidentally, our sermons on Sundays are also recorded, and you'll find one of Eric Friesen's sermons online, or several of them, where he says, doubt is the ants in the pants of faith. So this is a conversation I think lots of us need to keep having with one another about how we figure out faith or lack of faith, doubt, how we live with figuring out who God is. So I won't go on, but just to say there will be a few minutes for you to mingle, and you'll know when it's time to go because the lights will start to go out. Thanks again for coming. Good night.
Thank you.